4 of the corrective exercise specialist certification prep stuff, and it's for my PET 3104 class. I hope everybody is doing well. Let's dive right into this here and let's talk about the second phase of our continuum, our corrective exercise continuum, which is the lengthening techniques. The first, if we were to look at everything, would have been the inhibit techniques, which was that self-myofascial release. And now we're going to get into the lengthening component, which, if you really want to just break it down to simplistic terms, is flexibility. Okay, so the lengthening part is going to be different variations of flexibility and the ways that we go from the self-myofascial release component, the inhibin component, into the lengthening part to now starting to get a little bit more range of motion throughout our joints by opening those muscles up a little bit more. All right, so when we look at everything here, really what we want to understand are three terms. All right, the first one being flexibility. Obviously, flexibility is the ability of a joint to move through the whole range of motion. All right, whereas extensibility is more about how your muscle is able to stretch. And then muscle length is basically how far that muscle can go with, if you want to say passive movement, being able to, how far you can move that muscle and what's the length of those muscle fibers that they can achieve. Now, each person obviously is going to have different muscle lengths, but through flexibility and extensibility is going to show that. Okay. So when we get down to everything here in terms of the inhibitory techniques, what are we looking for? All right. Well, if you look at really what the lengthening portion of everything really is, it's about the elongation of mechanically shortened muscle and connective tissue to reduce their resistance to stretch and increase range of motion at the tissue and the joint. All right. So what we're saying here is we are trying to self-move, elongate, lengthen. All right, lengthen those muscles. We're not trying to contract them. We are trying to stretch them. All right, so elongate mechanically shortened muscles, meaning that muscles that were shortened due to you not taking care of them, or obviously not you, but your clients not taking care of them. It could also be more about just bad posture, anything that has culminated into this shortened muscle, meaning that it's tight. Okay, and the connective tissues. All right, so we're also talking about the ligaments and the tendons and the cartilage that's surrounding those regions to reduce their resistance to stretch. So we're going to lengthen so that we reduce stretch resistance. All right, and then increase range of motion. So that's really what we're looking at. Lengthening is more about just increasing range of motion by taking tight muscles and making them, well, ultimately looser. Okay, and that's really what we're looking at to do there. All right, so the goal here is whatever form of stretching, is really more about improving range of motion. It's about increasing tissue extensibility, which we talked about previously. All right, and then decreasing that risk of injury, and then also enhancing or increasing our neuromuscular efficiency, how well our nerves and muscles associate with each other. All right, so for each person that you're going to be working with, it's all going to be individualized at that point. So this may be something that you spend more time in than maybe versus the lengthening part of everything. All right, so we need to make sure that you might be spending more time in lengthening than you did in the inhibit, but we'll see what happens depending upon each person. So what are the major types? I'm sure you've heard a majority of them. You've heard static stretching, dynamic stretching, PNF, or what the book has changed, NASM has changed more to neuromuscular stretching, ballistic, and then active, and we'll kind of hit on each one of those. All right, so static, if you look at the major components of it, low to moderate forces, long duration holds, okay, that's what we're looking at there. The stretch is held at the first point of tension. Specific time periods are induced, but typically it's around 30 to 60 seconds. All right. And that, it's more of the common one that everybody knows about. PNF, or neuromuscular stretching, is more like what we would call let's see, it used to be called the stretch, relax, stretch mentality, where you'd stretch, you'd hold, you'd release, and then you stretch again, and you'd be able to get a little bit farther. With PNF, it really used to be more about a person assisting another person with this, but now with the advent, not really the advent, but with more individuals using more things like bands and towels, more things that you can hold with, we can do this more individually than needing and requiring a second person to be involved. All right, but usually what you do is you hold a specific position for 10 to 30 seconds, and then you contract those stretch muscles for about 5 to 10 seconds, and then release that contraction and hold that stretch, and then contract again, release, contract again, and release. And usually that's how it goes back and forth, is stretch, stretch, contract, and keep going back and forth. Dynamic stretching, on the other hand, is usually with controlled movement that you're going to put your muscles through a full range of motion. All right, so depending upon what your ability level are, you're definitely going to be looking at something like when you look at everything that we're going to be working with here, if you look at, we're definitely going to be working in this region here. So with your static stretching and your dynamic stretching, depending upon the person's ability level here, you may have people that might want to be working with the neuromuscular stretching, but I think it's more about this than anything else. All right, it's more about their ability to understand how to put themselves in that position. All right, but with their ability, it really is that's really what's going to make or break it. But definitely, and what their understanding of that stretch is about. But typically, everybody knows how to do static stretching here, and everybody knows how to do dynamic stretching, which a lot of people don't realize they know how to do it because they, growing up, even just doing something simple as arm circles is a dynamic stretch. Okay. The next two things are what we would call active stretching. All right. So what you're going to do here, like it says, is you're going to use multiple repetitions of 2-second static stretches. And then, at that point there, it says you emphasize a contraction of the antagonist to induce reciprocal inhibition. So at the end range, so you're going to stretch, you're going to hold, contract, and then release. That's the main part of everything here. And then do it again for a certain amount of reps. All right. Again, not as common, all right, not as common to be used, but can still be used for certain people depending upon what they want to do. All right, and then ballistic stretching. All right, what we're talking about there, you're looking more at it's dynamic. Let's just put this out there too. Dynamic does not equal ballistic. All right, and that sometimes can be a common thing that we have to understand, is that dynamic stretching is going with controlled movements through full ranges of motion. Here with ballistic, this is the fancy word that you really want to understand, is this word right here. I just had it. Oh, this is it right here. Bouncing. Bouncing is that word that you have to be aware of, because you're bouncing at the end of the range of motion and then going back through that stretch again. It is riskier, like it does say here, but it can be done. Athletes should be using them. If many people, martial arts is definitely, this is a group that uses ballistic stretching a lot. Gymnasts use this a lot. Fighters use this a lot. It's a common thing for athletes, but again, be very very careful and precautious working with your people using ballistic unless they can handle it. All right. So what happens neuromuscularly and mechanically that we can understand why this is important? Okay. With mechanical adaptations, static stretching can really affect what we would call the viscoelastic component of our tissue, our myofascial tissue. All right. So, having things be viscoelastic, what we're saying there is that you're able to allow things to, fluid-wise, Soft tissue wise, things are going to be able to stretch better. All right, but that has a lot to do with the fluid component of everything, along with the actual myofibril component of everything as well. So what happens though with static stretching is what it does. It causes what we love to use this fancy word right here, acute or short-term stress relaxation. All right, and at that point, acute, if we looked at it from that standpoint, from the acute just leads to chronic change. All right, so even though it's not something that just say you started stretching, one bout, one bout will increase. All right. So if we look at one bout, it's going to create a change and it's going to be a positive increase. So that's what we have to understand is that it starts small and it starts to increase at a greater rate. Okay. So what ends up happening is we end up with these changes, and now we start to realize that excitability or tightness at the end of our end range of motion is no longer there, and it's become diminished more, and that you no longer have the additional excitation that usually causes that tightness at the end. All right, so what also happens too is the muscle spindles end up having a response change. All right, this is more neuromuscularly, but the muscle spindle actually is able to send better signals, and it's able to create a different rate of change and response and allow you to extend more because it's not becoming your muscle spindles are not they're not experiencing that excessive tightness that they once felt, simply because the muscles are not as bound up because they've been used over and over again. Those viscoelastic properties are allowing more muscle movement, so then the muscle spindle is like, oh, okay, I can handle that a little bit better. So therefore you end up with more extensibility, more rate of elongation. All right. So again, what is it typically? This 30 to 60 seconds here is pretty common. Um, and then what ends up happening is you end up with, more prolonged, you end up with what we call disfacilitation, and the muscle can relax more and it can get deeper into that stretch like we want it to. So therefore it'll increase, so one bout's going to increase, but also understand that one bout is also going, especially with long hold stretches, one bout is also going to increase, under higher time. All right, as well. And that's really something cool that we can understand. There's a program that I actually use, and this isn't a sponsor tag or anything like that, but I use a program called ROMWAD. All right, there's other thing I've also seen. I think it's called GoWAD. And these are two apps that are out there for people who want to do stretching from home, and they're long duration holds. And what they are is they're, at some point, a lot of times it's the shortest I've seen is about 30 seconds per hold. The longest I've ever held a stretch in has been somewhere around 6 to 7 minutes in length. And it depends on what the positioning is and everything like that. But I will tell you that afterwards, it's amazing how much different your body feels and how much less tightness and tension that you feel because of that. All right. So long duration holds are not something unheard of, and they're definitely not something that you should, just dismiss. So basically with what we talked about here, this is where we're getting at, is that what we talked about here is that, you can hold longer and get more out of it. All right. So what really simply put with psychophysiological adaptations here, what we're saying is that the more people do, the more stretch tolerance they can handle, the more they're able to push themselves. Because one thing, again, this fancy word that no one likes, all right? So if we looked at it, cannot have pain, all right? Now, the one thing they do become more accustomed to is discomfort. All right, and that's really the main word. The word that we can have is we want pain does not equal discomfort as well. And that's one of the things that we have to understand is that discomfort in stretching is something that's going to happen, and we all know that we hate it. For the most part, I think, but not. I actually start the more I've done more lengthening techniques, the more flexibility I work on. the more stretching I do, the more I enjoy it. It's kind of like running. I hate running, but the more I seem to be doing it, the better I'm getting at it, the more I kind of feel a little bit more positive toward it. Okay. So, just understand that, there is a psychological benefit. And so the other reason too, more releasing of these words here, endorphins and ecophalins, which are opioids that are made by the body, and those are pain reducers. Okay. So there is a psychophysiological or psychological component to this as well. Now, with neuromuscular stretching, all right, or PNF, we kind of just hit on static. All right. With neuromuscular stretching, it has been touted as PNF, and again we talk about the stretch, contract, stretch cycle, or the contract, relax phases, whatever way you want to call it. But what you're doing with those 4 stages is you're taking to an end range and holding for 10 seconds. At that end range, you're going to contract at that stretch for about 5 to 10 seconds, not hard, but you're going to contract so that you can feel it, like sub max intensity. All right. So at that point there, you're going to release, and then you're going to passively try to pull yourself, passively and, both passively or actively, try to pull back a little bit farther. And you should be able to achieve a farther end range of motion when you do that. Okay. And then again, you do the same thing. Hold that stretch for 10 seconds, contract for 5 to 10 seconds, and then do it again. All right. And keep repeating that for about 3 times. But actually, I'm sorry, I mistakenly said the wrong thing there. But for the new position, you want to hold that for 20 to 30 seconds and then do the contract, relax. So it's allowing you to have a little bit in that deeper stretch. You're holding it for more time. Okay. So 10 seconds to start, 5 to 10 second contraction, release it, go to a new end range, hold for 20 to 30 seconds, and then contract for 5 to 10 seconds, and then do it one more time at that point. Okay. And that's really what we want to look at and see how far we can, get ourselves to keep moving backwards, especially if you have trying to, if you're lying on the ground and you got one leg down, one leg straight up, the knee is not flexed, it's fully extended, and you're pulling with just say a band your leg back toward you. Well, as your knee starts getting closer and closer to your chest, that shows that it's working more and more and more. Okay. With dynamic stretching, again, controlled movement through a full range of motion. This is the part that we want to emphasize right here. We talked about how it differentiates between ballistic, but here's the most important part here, and I'm going to give it a couple of checks. With sports performance or demanding exercise, what you consider demanding exercise, research has shown that using dynamic stretching before is superior to PNF and to static stretching. All right, it does induce an effect on you that also increases your temperature, but it definitely is more mimicking of the movements, and the muscles seem to enjoy that more. Okay, so that's one of the reasons why we're able to go farther. But again, shear and compressive stresses are the reason why these muscles are being stretched, because they're going through full range of motion. But that shear and compressive force is what is taking and allowing everything to not contract, but they are allowing them to lengthen like they're supposed to. So again, dynamic before is always more appropriate. All right. So there is some impact on athletic performance, like we saw pre-exercise stretching. But what are we looking at? Okay, in order of operation, really, it's if we're going to talk about pre-athletic performance, 1, 2, and then 3, and then this would be leading up. This would be number 4, simply because it's going to lead you to your performance, and that's the main part of that. All right. So, we're looking at just trying to improve our range of motion through duration, frequency, intensity, and then what our stretching duration is, meaning total time. All right. And that's what we're trying to understand there. All right. So what are we saying here is that look at the one difference here that we want to understand. This is it's hard to see, but look at the difference here. One is with higher compliance versus lower compliance. We know that with lower compliance, you have an increased risk of injury, and a higher compliance leads to of flexibility leads to a minimalization of injury risk. All right, able to absorb forces better. You're able to transfer energy better. All right, you're able to absorb more force, decrease the amount of trauma, so therefore you're decreasing the amount of injury. But also understand too, with pre-exercise stretching, this is what's going to happen, and this is why we really want to, take care of this, is that, with pre-exercise stretching, you want to make sure that you are taking care of your force length relationships. We want to decrease, stiffness. We want to increase, Golgi tendon, tension. That's Golgi tendons are detecting tension. We want to increase it so that we understand where we're at. All right. So we just want to make sure that overall we're taking care of our stretching in the right manner. All right. So the problem here, though, is that if this is static stretching, for example, this is what we're looking at here. This is static, and with static stretching, we can actually have a decrease in force production. All right, so we can't have that. We don't want to have increased muscle strain. This is what we don't want to have. So this is why static is, less superior than dynamic. All right, because dynamic is going to take and basically it's going to flip all these arrows around so that we are able to increase force production. Okay, so this is what it would be like if it was more static based. So again, with our warm up, okay, now taking it from just flexibility in general to now a warm up component. Yeah, we want to make sure that if you're working with non-athletes, it can go myofascial rolling. So we know this term here, all right, and this fancy term we also heard before, inhibit. All right, that's this first phase. So we're gonna, self-myofascial release, then go into our static stretching, followed by our dynamic. So we can actually offset the slowness of the static stretching with the increased demand of your dynamic stretching, and then more task specific. So doesn't mean you have to negate static stretching. It just means that use it at the most opportune times. Okay. So, but for me personally, I usually get rid of, in general, I get rid of this component here, in terms of, I just usually get rid of static stretching in general and just go, here to here, then to here. If I'm working with my athletes, and then this is minimal, at that point. That's kind of how I see it, but that's personal preference. Each coach and each professor each has their own suggestions on that, but that's how I like to roll with it. So again, with contraindications, be very careful. Pay attention to people who are with precautions. Doesn't mean you can't do specific things, but you got to be very careful with them. Contraindications, all right, we got to be very aware. Any acute injuries or muscle strains, any surgeries, anybody who has any sort of rheumatoid arthritis, and then anybody with osteoporosis, we got to be very careful with what stretching we're doing, or what type of stretching, or the specific joint regions that it's affecting. So be very careful of that. All right, so what are we looking at static stretching wise? 1 to 4 reps, 20 to 30 seconds with, some 60-second holds that are, a little bit longer. And then the frequency is per client, but again, what do we look at? I always say this, 5 to 7 days per week. I always enjoy that because that means you're going to be doing it most days. But that's what we're looking at there, okay? For examples, there's a ton of different examples. I'm sure that the interwebs can be fun for you, but this is where any of these, if you need to, what you can do is blow this up on your on your screen. You can zoom in and see more of it. but you can see how, we can static stretch. There's holds at the end ranges and not so much at the, you're not going through full range of motion. You're holding at a specific region. PNF, we talked about it, 1 to 3 reps. We really prefer if we were to get to this here. We'd rather have you at 3 reps. Contraction time, we said, and so the book also says 5 to 10, but here it says 7 to 10. All right, so 5 to 10 seconds with that 20-second stretch. All right, and it's as needed. It's as needed per your client, but it's a good thing to incorporate. Again, on a couple days a week. But again, if you need to use it on more days a week, go for it. And here's some really good examples here that you can see, and using different implements for that. Some of you may already be doing this on your own. Then dynamic, 90 seconds or less per muscle group. You want to have active control. And then, like it says, 1 cycle per second. And then most days of the week. And then you want to, you can break it up into upper and lower body. You can break it up into specific muscle groups you're using for the day. It just depends on what you're trying to achieve, okay? But follow those parameters for that, all right? So again, this is phase 2. This is lengthening, all right? First one was inhibiting. This is lengthening. So this is phase 2 of that corrective exercise continuum. And we're going to keep traveling along with this so that we can get better at those 4 phases, all right? So self-myofascial release. We talked about today flexibility and specific stretching. And the next lecture series or component will go into isolated strengthening, all right? So I hope everybody has a really good day, and I hope to hear from you soon. I hope you enjoy these videos. They're new for the content, so take a listen. If you have any feedback, let me know. Have a great day.